They were not locked in their barracks. No chains, no alarms, no shouted orders echoing through the camp. The fence was there, yes, but it was low enough to cross, weak enough to ignore, and guarded by men who were not pointing their rifles. So why did no one move? Why did hundreds of prisoners wake up that morning, look toward the same open spaces, and make the same silent decision without ever speaking aloud? If freedom was possible, why did it feel unreachable? And if nothing happened that day, why did everything begin to change? The morning unfolded without interruption, without urgency, and without any visible marker that distinguished it from the many mornings that had come before it. Yet something about it carried a different weight, not because of what occurred, but because of what did not. The prisoners woke at their usual hour, rising from bunks that were neither locked nor confined by force, stepping into a camp that presented no immediate obstacle to departure, no sudden reinforcement of guards, no tightening of rules, and no spoken warning that movement would be punished. The fence stood in the same place it had always stood, its presence familiar enough to be overlooked, its height insufficient to suggest absolute containment, and its condition unchanged in any meaningful way. From a purely physical standpoint, nothing prevented them from leaving. They could see the path beyond the perimeter. They could identify the gaps where supervision thinned. They understood, at least in theory, that no alarm would sound the moment someone crossed an invisible line. The guards did not shift their posture, did not raise their voices, and did not perform any gesture that implied a readiness to intervene. Yet no one tested the boundary. This absence of action did not result from an explicit decision made by a leader or reinforced by an order passed quietly among the men. Instead, it appeared almost simultaneously, as though each prisoner arrived at the same conclusion independently, guided not by instruction, but by an internal hesitation that had slowly taken shape long before that morning arrived. Some stood near the fence longer than usual, their attention lingering on the space beyond it, not with urgency, but with an unfamiliar sense of distance, as though the outside world had shifted slightly out of alignment, close enough to observe but not close enough to reach. Others avoided looking in that direction altogether, choosing instead to focus on routine tasks, repeating motions that required no reflection and offered no decision points. No announcement explained why they remained where they were. No warning clarified what would happen if they left, and no visible consequence threatened those who might attempt it. The camp, in that moment, relied on none of the mechanisms traditionally associated with confinement. It did not assert control through force, through rules, or through punishment. Instead, it remained passive, almost indifferent, allowing the prisoners to confront a condition far more destabilizing than restriction, the presence of choice without instruction. That condition proved disorienting. Without an external signal to define what was permitted and what was forbidden, the responsibility for action shifted inward, forcing each prisoner to measure not the risk of escape, but the uncertainty of what escape would mean. Leaving was no longer a reaction to pressure. It became an initiation, an act that required certainty in a situation deliberately stripped of clarity. As the hours passed, the lack of movement became noticeable, not because it was enforced, but because it was shared. Each man could see that others remained in place, and in that collective stillness, hesitation gained legitimacy. If no one else was leaving, then leaving alone carried a different significance, one that could not be evaluated using past experience or shared understanding. By midday, the opportunity still existed. By afternoon, it felt less accessible, and by evening, it no longer felt like an option at all. Nothing in the environment had changed, yet perception had narrowed, subtly and persistently, until the idea of departure no longer occupied the same mental space it had in the morning. The fence still stood, unchanged, but its function had quietly shifted from a physical boundary to a symbolic one, representing not what stopped them, but what no longer needed to. The camp had not closed. The prisoners had, and without realizing it, they had crossed the first threshold, not into captivity, but into a state where freedom required more than permission to exist. The second day did not present itself as a continuation that demanded attention, because nothing about it insisted on being noticed, and that quiet persistence was precisely what made it heavier than the first. Morning arrived without distinction, without alteration, and without any signal that the previous hesitation had been registered or acknowledged by those in control of the camp, creating the unsettling impression that whatever choice had been made the day before had already been absorbed into the structure without resistance. The guards repeated their movements with the same deliberate neutrality, neither reinforcing authority nor withdrawing it, maintaining a balance that felt less accidental with each passing hour. Instructions were given in the same tone as before, not sharpened by urgency and not softened by reassurance, which forced the prisoners to confront an uncomfortable realization. Nothing in the environment was pushing them in either direction, yet something inside them was slowly adjusting all the same. Routine, which had once offered stability through predictability, now began to work differently, because repetition without explanation stripped actions of meaning while demanding compliance nonetheless. Tasks were completed not because they clarified the situation, but because refusing to complete them would require a certainty no one felt prepared to claim. The camp functioned efficiently, almost politely, but that efficiency no longer felt neutral, as it created the sense that inactivity itself had been calculated rather than accidental. As the hours passed, the absence of consequence became more disturbing than the presence of threat, since punishment would have at least confirmed the boundaries that still technically existed. Instead, the lack of response to hesitation suggested that hesitation itself had already been anticipated. Waiting became a shared posture, not enforced by command, but sustained by the unspoken understanding that acting prematurely might be more dangerous than remaining still. The prisoners began observing not the guards, but one another, measuring posture, timing, and restraint, as if trying to determine whether confidence still existed anywhere within the group. Each unchallenged moment reinforced the sense that no intervention was coming, and that whatever was expected of them would not be requested explicitly. The silence did not demand obedience. It reshaped behavior more effectively than orders ever could. The fence remained visible, unchanged in structure and position, but it no longer occupied the same psychological role it had on the first day, because its relevance depended on intention rather than accessibility. The idea of crossing it required not courage, but clarity, and clarity was becoming increasingly scarce. Without a defined violation, every possible action carried the risk of being interpreted after the fact rather than prevented beforehand. By the end of the second day, nothing had occurred that could be documented as escalation, yet the internal landscape had shifted noticeably. Thought patterns narrowed, movements became more economical, and decision-making quietly transferred from individual judgment to collective hesitation. The camp did not need to assert control, because it had succeeded in creating a space where control no longer required reinforcement. What made this day dangerous was not what happened, but the growing awareness that nothing needed to happen at all, because uncertainty itself had begun to perform the work that force usually accomplished. And with that realization came a question that remained unresolved as night settled in. If a system can alter behavior without issuing a single threat, how long does it take before resistance becomes unnecessary? By the third day, the absence of intervention could no longer be interpreted as coincidence, because repetition had transformed it into a pattern, and patterns, once recognized, begin to influence behavior even when their purpose remains unclear. The guards continued to occupy the same physical space, yet their role had subtly shifted from visible authority to something more ambiguous, something defined less by action and more by deliberate restraint. They watched without correcting. They observed without reacting. And in doing so, they introduced a new form of pressure that did not rely on force, but on interpretation. The prisoners began to understand that nothing would be clarified for them in advance, and that any mistake would likely be identified only after it had already been made, which created a condition where caution replaced initiative and self-monitoring replaced decision-making. The lack of direct engagement from the guards was not reassuring, because it suggested that supervision had moved to a level that no longer required visible enforcement. Movement within the camp became slower, not because it was restricted, but because it was increasingly calculated. Every step carried the silent question of how it might be perceived, even if no one responded outwardly. The guard's neutrality functioned like a mirror, reflecting uncertainty back onto the prisoners rather than resolving it, forcing each man to become responsible not only for his actions, but for predicting how those actions might later be framed. What unsettled them most was the realization that intervention was possible at any moment, yet consistently withheld, which made the timing of any future response impossible to anticipate. Without warning signals, behavior began to contract inward, as men chose the safest version of themselves rather than the most decisive one. Silence expanded not because speech was forbidden, but because speaking introduced variables that could not be controlled. The guard's posture never changed, yet it became increasingly difficult to read, because stillness can be interpreted in multiple ways when intention is concealed. Were they waiting for compliance to solidify, or for resistance to reveal itself? Were they indifferent, or was indifference itself the method? These questions circulated internally, unanswered, gradually replacing older concerns about escape or resistance with newer concerns about interpretation and consequence. As observation replaced enforcement, the prisoners unconsciously adjusted their conduct to avoid attracting attention, even though attention had never been explicitly defined as dangerous. This adjustment did not require instruction, because uncertainty encourages self-regulation more efficiently than rules ever could. Each man began to anticipate limits that had never been stated, and once anticipated, those limits no longer needed to be imposed. The fence remained in the background, present but increasingly irrelevant, because the challenge was no longer physical movement, but psychological permission. Crossing the boundary now felt less like an act of courage and more like an exposure, a declaration made in an environment that offered no feedback, no context, and no guarantee of meaning. In the absence of reaction, intention itself became risky. By the end of the third day, the most significant change was not exhaustion or fear, but internal alignment, as behavior across the camp began to converge without coordination, producing uniformity through uncertainty rather than command. The guards had not intervened, yet order had emerged, shaped quietly by anticipation and restraint. This was the moment when it became clear, though never stated, that control no longer depended on what the guards did, but on what they chose not to do, and that the space left by their inaction was being filled steadily by the prisoners themselves, adjusting, conforming, and limiting their own possibilities without being asked. As night settled once more, a troubling realization lingered beneath the surface of routine. If authority no longer needs to act in order to be effective, then the most decisive intervention may already have occurred, not through force or instruction, but through silence that teaches behavior to regulate itself. By the fourth day, the most noticeable change within the camp was not visible in posture or movement alone, but in the way each prisoner began to experience himself in relation to the environment, because the internal reference points that once guided behavior had started to blur without resistance. The routines continued without disruption, yet they no longer felt temporary, and that subtle shift altered how time itself was perceived, stretching moments not through hardship, but through repetition that carried no identifiable end. Names were still spoken when necessary, but they carried less weight, functioning more as signals than as markers of individuality, while personal habits slowly gave way to standardized movement and shared timing. The prisoners did not consciously abandon their identities, yet they stopped reinforcing them. And in the absence of reinforcement, distinction faded naturally. This was not the result of pressure applied from above, but of adaptation occurring quietly from within. The camp did not require them to forget who they were, because forgetting became efficient once remembering ceased to offer any advantage. Personal initiative diminished, not through prohibition, but through irrelevance, as actions detached from outcome began to feel interchangeable. When effort no longer produced a discernible effect, conserving energy became logical, and conserving energy gradually reshaped priorities, narrowing attention toward what could be controlled rather than what could be changed. Conversations, when they occurred, remained factual and restrained, stripped of speculation or emotional framing, because expressing uncertainty out loud no longer felt productive. Each man carried his questions privately, not because trust had disappeared, but because articulation itself had begun to feel unnecessary. The internal dialogue replaced external exchange, creating a quiet isolation that existed even in shared spaces. The guards continued their observation without alteration, yet their presence had receded into the structure of the environment, no longer perceived as an active force, but as a constant condition. Authority no longer needed to assert itself, because behavior had already aligned to avoid attracting attention, and attention had become something to manage rather than something to seek. This alignment did not require fear, only awareness, and awareness proved sufficient to maintain order. As the day progressed, subtle signs of synchronization emerged, visible in pacing, posture, and timing, as though the camp had established an unspoken rhythm that everyone instinctively followed. Deviations became rare, not because they were punished, but because they felt unnecessary, and unnecessary actions began to register internally as risks rather than expressions of self. The cost of standing out could not be measured, yet its possibility alone was enough to discourage experimentation. The fence still existed as a physical marker, but it no longer represented separation between captivity and freedom, because the distinction itself had lost clarity. The question was no longer whether escape was possible, but whether the desire to escape remained intact, and that question proved harder to answer than expected. Without external reinforcement, motivation softened, not disappearing entirely, but losing urgency with each repeated cycle of the day. By evening, the cumulative effect became difficult to ignore because the absence of conflict had allowed conformity to settle into place without resistance. Identity had not been taken, challenged, or dismantled directly, yet it had begun to dissolve through disuse, fading into the background of routine and shared behavior. This dissolution did not feel dramatic, which made it more complete, as there was no single moment to identify as the point of loss. As night fell once again, the realization emerged slowly and without clarity. If identity depends on action, choice, and consequence, then a system that neutralizes consequence does not need to attack identity at all. It only needs to make it unnecessary. And in that quiet space where individuality no longer served a purpose, something essential was slipping away, not through force, but through the steady comfort of compliance, that asked nothing and therefore took everything. By the fifth day, compliance no longer presented itself as a reaction to circumstance, but as a preference shaped quietly by repeated exposure to uncertainty, because the effort required to choose had begun to outweigh the perceived benefit of action. The camp had not demanded submission, yet submission had emerged as the most stable position available within an environment that offered no reliable feedback. What made this shift difficult to identify was its subtlety, because no rule had changed and no pressure had increased, yet behavior had settled into a narrower range of possibility. The prisoners still moved freely within the camp, still spoke when necessary, and still completed their routines without obstruction. But those routines now functioned less as temporary measures and more as the framework through which reality was processed. Choice, once associated with opportunity, had become associated with exposure. Every potential deviation required justification, not externally, but internally, and justification demanded clarity that no longer felt accessible. Acting without clear consequence had become uncomfortable because uncertainty stripped decisions of grounding, making restraint appear rational rather than passive. In this context, compliance did not feel imposed, but protective, offering insulation from ambiguity rather than surrender to authority. The guards remained unchanged in posture and presence, yet their role had become almost symbolic because the regulation of behavior was now occurring internally, guided by anticipation rather than enforcement. Their silence continued to function as a boundary that could not be measured, and therefore could not be tested safely. The absence of response had trained the prisoners to assume that the safest course was the one least likely to be noticed. Gradually, the effort to maintain individuality began to feel inefficient, not because it was forbidden, but because it produced no discernible outcome. Expressions of preference, initiative, or resistance no longer altered the environment, and when action ceases to influence result, conserving energy becomes an instinctive adaptation. This adaptation did not announce itself as defeat, but as practicality, allowing each man to believe he was simply adjusting rather than yielding. As the day progressed, compliance became normalized through repetition, reinforced by the visible behavior of others, creating a feedback loop where restraint validated restraint. No conversation confirmed this shift explicitly, yet it was reflected in timing, posture, and silence, as though a shared understanding had formed without agreement. In this state, the absence of conflict was no longer reassuring, but it was familiar, and familiarity provided comfort that uncertainty could not. The fence remained where it had always been, unchanged in structure and accessibility, yet it no longer occupied the same mental position, because crossing it would now require disrupting a balance that had taken days to establish. Leaving was no longer framed as escape, but as disruption, an act that would reintroduce unpredictability into a system that had become internally regulated. Stability, even when restrictive, began to feel preferable to possibility. By evening, it was evident that the most significant transformation had already occurred, not through confrontation or coercion, but through alignment. Behavior had synchronized, expectations had narrowed, and the emotional cost of deviation had quietly increased. Compliance did not feel like submission, because submission implies force, and no force had been applied. Instead, it felt like resolution, a way to exist within the environment without constantly negotiating uncertainty. As night settled over the camp once again, a realization lingered beneath the surface of routine, unspoken but increasingly difficult to ignore. When compliance feels safer than choice, control no longer needs to be enforced because it has already been accepted. And once acceptance replaces resistance, the system no longer requires pressure to sustain itself, because the work of containment has shifted inward, maintained not by authority, but by the very individuals it confines. This was not the end of the process, but it marked a closure, because something essential had been resolved without ceremony, leaving behind a condition that would shape everything that followed. The camp had not changed, yet the men within it no longer related to it in the same way. And in that quiet adjustment lay the foundation for what would come next, not as an event, but as a continuation that no longer required choice to proceed. By the end of that sequence of days, no announcement marked a transition, and no visible action confirmed that anything irreversible had occurred, yet the atmosphere within the camp no longer resembled its beginning. What had changed was not the structure, nor the rules, nor the presence of authority, but the internal calibration through which each man now interpreted possibility. The fence still stood, the routines still repeated, and the silence still carried no explicit meaning. Yet the space between thought and action had widened enough to make hesitation feel natural. Freedom had not been removed, but it had lost its urgency, becoming an abstract idea rather than an immediate condition. In adapting to uncertainty, the prisoners had unknowingly accepted a form of stability that required nothing from them except continuity. This was not an ending defined by collapse or submission, but by adjustment, because the most effective transformations rarely announce themselves. The camp did not close in, yet something essential had shifted inward, leaving behind a question that no longer demanded an answer, but lingered all the same. When a system no longer needs to restrain you because you have learned to restrain yourself, at what point does captivity truly begin?